Well, all right. So we're back with another episode, and I've been waiting a long time to have a discussion and maybe a healthy debate or dig into some challenges on this whole office repositioning issue that the whole country seems to be facing. And our podcast favorite, Eliot, over here, has been insisting on having Kate join us from New York City, from the design community. So, Kate, I'm happy you joined, and I'm looking forward to this. But maybe we can start with Eliot, where you met Kate, and sort of why all of this is relevant.
So Kate and I met, and Kate is a partner at Cobb, right?
I am.
Kate is a partner at Cobb, which is a pretty large architecture firm based in New York City. I'll let her tell you more about that. But we met on a project near Rockefeller Center called 1221 Avenue of the Americas. And it was a repositioning study that we all worked on as part of a team with general contractor, owner, facade consultant, and mechanical engineering firm to look at the potential for recladding and upgrading mechanical systems. And during that process, I realized something that I think Kate and the other team members knew all along, that the design, the work, they're all important parts, but there's so much more to repositioning large office buildings than people account for in just thinking about what's the cost of a new mechanical system, what's the cost of a facade, whatever you're going to do, overclad, reclad, retrofit. And really, it's a team effort. It really is. And it's so important for owners to understand this and really look at developing a team that they can trust, because it's a very, very long-term process, and then picking the appropriate members.
Maybe Kate, you can answer this from the architecture side, and I guess maybe after doing a project and having more experience, is there a reluctance or fear to take on the challenge of an existing building if maybe your comfort zone is new construction? I think some firms kind of like to market themselves or position themselves as experts in that arena. And I think some can find it intimidating, especially because you don't know what you're getting into until you really dig into the underlying conditions. So was it a daunting task at first to take on? And is it something now you have more confidence and comfort in?
Absolutely. And so Cobb has been around for almost 70 years. And actually, I've been talking about retrofits and recladding, repositioning as kind of a new area of practice that we never called that a market before, right? But it actually is its own market. And I think the problem solving behind finding all those existing conditions is exactly why it's exciting. And our firm's history, and also history with building enclosure expertise, made us particularly suited for studying those kinds of things. So yeah, we're all in. I like it. It's not easy, but I like it.
Yeah, I think it's normal for us in New York. I mean, Eliot, you've been talking about window replacement since the day I met you, but also that it's just been an ongoing business for decades and decades and decades here in New York, and that it'll be a forever business. But you go to other markets and it's not the norm, and maybe people think they don't have the specialty contractors to do that type of work. And I think you have capable contractors, but it might be a reluctance from owners to take on such work. I don't know. What's your thought, Eliot, on some of the reluctance to really take on existing building work in other markets versus a New York where maybe there's just a higher level of comfort?
I think part of it is because we do things a little differently in New York. We don't just call two replacement window companies and get competitive bids. In New York, there's a lot more tendency to hire an architect, facade consultant, or engineer to oversee and supervise the process of doing a replacement window job or a recladding job or even reglazing projects. And I think that's one of the major differences is here we rely on professionals to guide the owner and what the project's going to be like, where they're best spending their money, how much is too much when they spend sometimes, how much is not enough. And having a lot of experience in the process helps. And that's where you need a professional.
Do you think yeah.
I was going to chime in there. Just that's my time to say that I think I've heard it said that owners want new buildings, and maybe in other parts of the country that's harder to get over. But I think owners want good buildings, and I think what we're realizing through this work is that there's many ways to make a good building, even one that exists already. So,
Well, how about the competitive landscape as well? If you have a Class A, Class B, Class C office space or residential space on the same block, and owners feeling this sort of competitive edge on how am I going to attract tenants moving forward?
absolutely. And that's what we find valuable about that kind of team approach that Elliot was talking about. So we had all these various things, design and architecture, testing, all the logistics, but it really also comes down to the value creation that you could achieve by doing this, and therefore the funding that's available for it for the owner. And without making that bottom line work, no one's going to do it just because it's the right thing to do.
Well, before COVID, now the hot topic, well, I don't want to say there's always been an affordable housing shortage, really. That's kind of seems to be an ongoing theme. Now the hot topic is converting office space because of the lack of need. Maybe you're joining the two issues, kind of the runaway from the typical office space coupled with a shorting housing. So you're killing two birds with one stone. But Elliot and I talk a lot about how these major upgrades aren't triggered or initiated purely because of the energy savings. The amount of time for them actually to get the payback on a $50, $100, $300 million upgrade purely from their operational energy cost savings is, we're talking decades. It's typically instigated from the fact that either they can't lease the space, maybe there's a major building wide leak issue, or maybe all the IGUs are failing, or they're converting the space. What is it that you think kind of triggers these upgrades? And do you think we need more government incentive in order to move forward?
So I want to start with, I guess, yeah, I think that there's only so much you can do with an envelope, and there's various points of research, right, where somebody, if only 40% of your energy use can be chalked up to the facade, and you can make up that number whatever percentage you want, but the point is that there's other systems. So as owners are looking at the decarbonization, in addition to the fines, sometimes the motivating factor is actually their corporate goals in terms of net zero, whatever it is. But looking at all that, lost my train of thought. Looking at all that, I think that it's not going to be just the facade that does it. They're going to start with the low hanging fruit, like the systems upgrades, or even the um, you know BMS kind of things that they can do. And then you get to a point where there's not much more you can do to the building, except for put less people in it with less plug loads, or do something to the envelope.
All right, I love this discussion point. This is for Elliot because it's in new construction, at least historically, we didn't take this approach, and maybe we're taking the approach first, where if you start with the envelope, you can really get efficient when it comes to your lighting and your mechanical systems and everything else that comes along with it, all your secondary, means of hard costs in construction. But in an existing building, you're dealt with what you have. And so a lot of times they're sort of playing catch up. How can we really beef up this mechanical system, put in a new hot water heater system or whatever it is? And it's super, super hard to measure. How do you quantify, we're going to do a window replacement job, and then all of a sudden your energy and utility bills are going to be dropped by 40, 50, 60%. And when a building owner comes to you and asks that, and you tell them there's no real way to answer it, what's the feedback?
So there wasn't any good method of doing that. And thank you for the softball, by the way. Yeah, there wasn't really a good way of doing that in the past. We've been developing tools to measure air leakage very accurately and thermal conductivity, what we refer to more as R value and U value, to help us really identify and separate out claims, marketing claims, from actual performance that we think we're going to get. Because the worst thing that can happen to our business, the business that Kate was talking about of repositioning buildings, is if we misrepresent the performance gains for the first few years. Because if we do that, it's going to be worse than it was when people were trying to predict what single trade things like window replacement was going to do, and was not realized most of the time. Yes, you got nice, new, clean, functioning windows, but the energy savings didn't happen the way the modeling showed it was going to happen. And that's true on a lot of energy efficiency upgrades. That's why the low hanging fruit was so much easier, because if you just cut a unit down or make a unit more efficient, you can predict very accurately, as long as all the conditions stay the same, that you're going to save X number of kilowatt hours of BTUs, and that's going to convert into dollars saved per year over an average number of years. But with the facade, there was very few metrics, and it was always, oh, this is only contingent on certain other things happening, like the mechanical systems also being upgraded at the same time. That's why taking this holistic team approach is so important, especially for the studies, because you really, really need to look at this as a long-term program. This is not something that you do in a year usually, or 2 years, or 3 years even. You really need to look at it. Just incentives. Just look, you mentioned government incentives. Right now, that's real murky. And the ones that are out there don't apply to a lot of larger projects for larger owners. We were told on one, it's not worth going for $1 million incentive because it's not enough money to justify the paperwork. So, that's something that, you have to take into account, and they'll catch up. The government programs and the utility programs will catch up.
If you think about measuring energy performance and sort of this team approach, are the mechanical consultants or contractors and the envelope consultants or contractors incentivized to work together, or is there a little bit of a conflict of interest there?
In what way?
In that we improve our envelope, all of a sudden you can downsize your mechanical system, or what it is that they're trying to push versus what it is that they are trying to push, and sort of what agendas one another might have. I don't know. I mean, do you see that collaboration between the two?
Yeah, I do. Right, Kate? I mean,
Yeah.
to a degree.
I think actually,
don't they work? I mean, don't they really work in tandem?
They have to, and they
Yeah.
have to be able to speak the same language. One of the things that Elliot, another thing that you've talked about a lot is sort of how all these different metrics have to speak to each other. So I think that's a challenge, but the engineers that we're working with are committed to decarbonization, and so they're interested in this. I mean, whether someone who sells sheet metal wouldn't be interested, I mean, like that's probably true, but in terms of the design professionals, everyone's on board. It's my experience.
This is going to be, yeah, I don't want to name the market. I'm just going to say it's a market trending down south, maybe in a little bit of a warmer climate. And we heard from the team that the owner was looking at alternate means of ventilation to meet code. And they were weighing out operable windows versus fixed, and then their mechanical requirements and vents and so forth. And they were thinking about putting in trickle vents as an additional means of natural ventilation, which you can close and open the unit just like you can close and open an operable window. And the mechanical consultant came back and said they were discouraging operable windows and trickle vents because they didn't want to allow any unwanted humid air into conditioned space in the warmer months. And I'm sitting there kind of scratching my head and trying to wrap my head around it, but it just like, I don't know if that was more of like a uneducated market or what, or a conflict inherently, but it's sort of nice to hear that in New York, this precedent has been set that the whole thing has to work in tandem, and everybody's sort of pushed from day one to work together to put forward the most efficient whole building solution.
Some of that is owner constraints with budget, right? Whenever I hear about
I mean, I hope that was I don't know if you two are confused or left just boggled, or you're like, I don't even want to
continue
this conversation.
I mean, it's also having that longer term view, right? Because we need to, what we're finding on a lot of buildings that have upgraded their facade and upgraded their mechanical systems is a condition that the cooling system at least doesn't go on enough to dehumidify the air. So separate dehumidification is the reality going forward, whether owners want to accept that or not. You will get uncomfortable conditions because we relied on air conditioning to actually dehumidify for decades and decades, and that's not going to work once we make the envelope more efficient, because the systems don't turn on enough, basically.
Reminds me, 10 years ago, we were working on atria and talking about operable windows, and in the shoulder season, leaving the windows open. And there was definitely a resistance, like, well, I can't do my calculations if you leave it open, right? But I feel like we are getting past that.
where do you see a greater opportunity? Some of your sort of older pre-war buildings with lower window-to-wall ratios, or a lot of our kind of underutilized, coming to the end of their life cycle, 1970s, 1980s curtain wall buildings that haven't been upgraded yet.
Elliot, you might have I mean, so we haven't done a lot of looking at the sort of pre-war buildings with the punch windows. I understand intuitively the idea that you could be successful with a building that has less glass in it, but actually in our study, the one we did with Elliot, we found one of the most successful schemes was the one with the giant piece of glass, right? Because there was less metal and less conduction. So if we take Elliot's lesson that it's conduction and air leakage that are the most important things, I think it makes those sort of end of life buildings good candidates.
I mean, I asked Elliot, maybe you want to chime in here. New York might be unique, but we have more than enough of both of those types of facades and existing building stock within the city that need to be addressed. I mean, you go to the 40s, Third Avenue over there in Midtown East, for a long period, it was highly vacant and just underutilized 40, 50-year-old curtain wall buildings. And you go to other areas, I don't know, maybe in the 40s on the west side, 30s, Koreatown. Think about all the underutilized, Class B or C office space over there. So two underutilized buildings within somewhat proximity, but two different challenges at hand.
We've reclad a lot of those brick buildings. We've overclad them with curtain wall, utilize the existing window openings. A couple of jobs open those up larger, but for the most part, left them the way they were and just hung a curtain wall in front of them. And those worked out. Now, those were in response to new buildings like Salesforce Tower, Bank of America, moving into that area you're talking about, the 50s on the west side of Manhattan. But same thing in Chicago and Philly and other markets where you have the older pre-war, post-war, early post-war buildings that were built very well. The structure's good. They have to do some, tenant infrastructure upgrades, usually like high-speed internet and things like that. But once they can reclad it and turn it into a sleek glass office building, it really helps them rent compared to a brand new glass sleek office building. As far as the early curtain wall jobs of 50s through the late 70s, early 80s, that's got so much potential. Some of those leaked, and you asked before, what's the driver? So one of the drivers that we forget is a lot of these buildings just failed, right? We have quite a few buildings that the curtain wall just doesn't work anymore. It's letting in too much air to the point where the building professionals that are living with the consequences of that in the building are constantly ramping up speed on motors if it's going to rain so that it does. We had one, and this was an 80s building where in Midtown Manhattan, where the building guys would have to actually run in every time there was rain coming because the back pressure in the building or the stack pressure in the building was so bad that they had to amp up the blowers to repressurize the building to keep water from getting in. So that's a good candidate for looking at this and saying, so there's more going on here than just aesthetics or energy. It's an actual failed building that's really not operating well. No one's comfortable in that building, and it's a 57-story, 60-story building, so it's not like a small building. And they need to do something. They just don't know what to do. Honestly, that's why getting this message out is important, because people don't have a clue what they need to do sometimes. And they don't trust the people who are just trying to come in and sell them a brand new curtain wall because they don't believe that that'll fix every one of their problems. And they may be right.
So let's forget about the full reclad kind of by Manhattan West type of monumental project that, you might have worked on, or that might be a staple to a Brookfield Properties or so forth. What about simpler remedial fixes? I kind of had turned an eye to things like window films and interior storm windows and stuff like that. But the reality is, how much of that are you actually seeing out there, and how effective are some of these kind of secondary means of, maybe call it a Band-Aid approach or give it another 5 or 10 years approach?
Oh yeah, I think that was for you.
Yeah, I'm waiting at the guy who's smirking over there because he sees more of it than I do.
So there's a lot of, that's where all the government incentives are going now, right? It's to these supposedly easy fixes that look good on paper. And I'm not knocking any of these systems that are out there to put on an interior storm window, but really it doesn't check all the boxes, and it is to me, it's an interim fix. It's that, like we said, it's a 10-year plan to take a large commercial building and figure out what you're going to do with the mechanicals, the tenants that are in the building, because believe me, this is disruptive work that's going to really make people less than happy that are in spaces in the building. And the facade and everything else, that takes so long. The plan just to relocate people takes years. To plan it, not to do it, just to plan it and negotiate it with people. One of the buildings we worked on together had like the top 5 law firms in the world occupying the top 20 floors of this building. And the concessions to them were going to be tremendous, and it was negotiated. So there wasn't like, you tell them what you're going to do. These are very powerful firms that are going to tell you what they'll accept. And that's a back and forth process that doesn't take 6 months. So the interim window films, inserts, reglazing, that stuff can get you past some initial fine stages for the next 5 years, maybe. But, I always tell people, look at it as a solution for now. The long-term solution, obviously, is something that's more substantial.
Let's look past the windows for 1 second. What do you do about a brick building? Call it either failing masonry. If you have uninsulated brick, maybe brick without ties, structural ties. What is the solution there? I mean, just rip it all down. Is there a way to kind of repoint it and work within it, overclad it? I know you have some constraints from insulating from the interior. So when you look at some of these brick buildings, just from a life safety and structural standpoint, what goes through your head? Kate.
Me? I was actually thinking, I'm going a little bit sideways from that, but I'm thinking about the old brick buildings that were made to breathe, and that when they get sealed up, because everyone's really proud of themselves for putting in the new windows, then there's like condensation all over. And it's like, how do you get rid of the condensation? Well, you'll crack your window in the winter because it's right. And that's like, oh my gosh. So I think that's where the interdisciplinary team though really comes in to do an analysis of what the existing conditions are. And I think a lot of what Eliot and I are talking about are very bespoke, big projects that you're going to need to, just like the person who's selling you the inserts for your window, they have some rules of thumb about how that's going to improve, right? But what we're talking about is really getting into the details of the specific building to figure out what we can save and what we can't.
Yeah, and I think once you get past a 5-story building, there's no one answer or standard solution for those buildings. You start getting it to 20 stories and above, everyone is going to be different. Starting with, usually that's where we ask the owner to retain a facade consultant that can look at the existing facade and determine what's worth saving, what's not worth saving. Are we just pulling off the outer layer of brick and the rest of it's still okay? How much is a budget for repairing structural defects in the wall? There's a lot of buildings we can't touch. Historic buildings, we can't alter the way they look, whether it's New York City landmarks, Parks Department throughout the rest of the country. Almost every major city's got their own preservation laws now. So there's constraints on what you can and can't do. We try to look at where are the major sources of heat loss within that facade. And even though brick walls aren't insulated usually in the older buildings, nobody's really thought about insulating them. We see problem areas. Most of those buildings have steam or hot water radiant heat, right? So they have radiators. The radiator's usually right under a window. That's usually the worst spot on the wall because although the walls are very good conductors and bad insulators, source heat for that conduction is important. So if you have 72-degree air in most of the building, most of the room, but where that radiator is, you have 200-degree air because the radiator is radiating against that wall. It's a very high source of heat loss that we are working on methods with minimal disruption to the space to be able to super insulate that wall using newer technologies like vacuum insulated panels that we literally just install right behind those radiators and look at maybe a window replacement with a high performance window. And that helps a lot. And then a radiant barrier behind the radiator and things like that help too. And with a minimal amount of disruption in a historic building, we can get them some substantial savings through the leakage in the old walls.
Wasn't the Empire State Building like a tremendous kind of, and maybe I didn't have firsthand experience, but kind of a tremendous case study in what can be done in revitalizing a building? You know much about it?
I think they had a NYSERDA case study or something I read, but I don't know too much more.
I'm an old guy, so I remember when they reglazed.
Yeah, no, I know.
You remember when they
knows
built
the full
it?
story. That's why I was waiting for.
Almost. My brother does. But yeah, listen, I remember when they changed the windows and installed Traco double hung replacement windows 35 years ago, and then 15 years ago when they put a specialty insulating glass in that they actually made on the site, which I think they've gone ahead and replaced those again. So that's why it's important to really look at these decisions and determine, what's the best long-term, short-term plan for a building and an owner.
So let's get back to the more kind of exciting, fun side of it. Aside from energy upgrades and having to comply with codes and laws, what are the opportunities in terms of Kate, where do you see the sexiness in revitalizing a building and attracting new tenants, and what can be done? Do you think it's kind of an attractive area for designers and architects to focus on?
I do, and for us, I think it's exciting to think about which parts of the building are historic parts are assets of the building, and which parts you don't need to maybe focus on. So for us, the project 1271 Avenue of the Americas we did for Rockefeller Group, and Eliot was involved, I think, in some of that. That one was great because it was a lot of these buildings, they're built for one tenant, right? And now there's a multi-tenant building. So there's a whole part about sort of turning the lobby inside out in a way that's going to be useful for the next 60 years of the building's life. And in that case, that lobby was an interior landmark, so it required review with landmarks, and it was super exciting process to go through and figure out, the cool new reception desks we got to put in this civic space. They're very nice.
And the mega panels on that project too were cutting edge, right?
Yeah, so we had doubled the module to, it was 9'6", I want to say, at the time they were big. Is that what you mean? Oh, you mean
Yeah.
the storefront ones? Yeah, the storefront.
No, both actually. I mean, larger use of glass on that project actually was a winner on multiple fronts, right, Kate? Aesthetically, it was actually, once they worked it out, I think it was actually a benefit cost-wise, wasn't it?
Yeah, and it was the building's 40% more efficient after that renovation, which was a full reclad except for the limestone columns, which were left intact.
Do you guys have any interest or hear people talking about vacuum glazing?
There are people talking about it. I actually listened to in preparation for this, I listened to one of your old podcasts yesterday about it.
Well, I'll be honest. So I was recently in a market that is now, because of their codes, basically building to the Passive House standard. And I was speaking with an architecture firm, and they didn't know what vacuum glazing was. And I was like, this thing that's been around for almost 100 years, and a lot of people are trying to position it to potentially be the solution. I think there's unknowns in supply chain and longevity and durability, but I don't know. I mean, Eliot, do you think it's a viable solution and will gain traction, especially in a market like New York?
I do. I think that does check off lots of boxes. I mean, it's vacuum, right? So vacuum is the best insulator we can get, and it obviously it's not a total vacuum, so it doesn't get to the point where you're reaching scientific insulating values. But for buildings, it's the best option we have right now for insulating glass in new stuff. I mean, it's lighter weight usually, smaller. It performs very, very well. There's retrofit versions that I've been seeing now where they're actually making it into a conventional insulating unit where one side of it is the vacuum panel, which I think is great. The overseas component of it makes me a little uncomfortable now, but I also understand that there's at least two companies that are going to come online in the next year or so. One of them may have come online already. I'm not up to date on it right now, but that's a big deal, for me, it's a big deal because I want to be able to get it. If I'm the facade consultant, I want to get into that plant and make sure I see it being produced, especially the glass.
Well, okay, so I want Elliot to kind of play the, veteran devil's advocate, and then Kate to play the fun. Is it going to drive kind of attention and attraction from a tenant standpoint? But that's vacuum. Let's look at dynamic glass now. There's one tenant owner in particular in New York that utilized that as sort of a big marketing trend to convert a lot of their office space. And then I haven't seen as much of it as I thought I would. Do you think that is a strong sort of marketing attractor for onboarding new tenants? And any reason why we haven't seen more of it in New York or other markets? And let me preface, I don't know what your experience is with it or if you've seen it in person.
I don't have too much experience with it. No.
Elliot?
So the three things that we look at is air leakage, conductive loss, and then solar gain, right? Solar gain's a big one on high-rise buildings, and it's a big one in the South, or a large part of the country doesn't have problems with retaining heat. They have problems with keeping the heat out of the building. And you do that by coatings that are either tinted or reflective, mechanical shading, fixed shading, or switchable glass. So when they get the prices where they need to be broader in the market, I think it'll definitely be something people look at. The control systems have to be integrated into the building, into the facade system, so it's more challenging. But yeah, I mean, we're seeing it in the Middle East a lot more, right? They're using
Really?
it. Yeah, I think they're using it in casinos and hotels in the Emirates and places like that, where it's very important. I mean, it's very, very
I
hot
thought
and
they want,
sunny.
yeah, I thought they want no windows in casinos.
I don't mean in the casino. I mean in those casino hotel high
Photoshop.
rises, shaped like a bird.
Got it. Well, so you think the issue, it's a cost issue, it's not a comfort or sort of track record issue?
I think right now it's a cost issue for sure. I haven't heard about any failures other than, again, the wiring systems and the controls for it have to be integrated correctly. And I think the early ones were just not done well. The control systems weren't done well.
I mean, on the flip side, I think the track record is the bigger issue for vacuum. I think though various suppliers will be very competitive to get it out there and have um, case studies and examples to show people in the market. But I think it's a lack of comfort, especially like you said, from some of the facade experts and building owners wanting to go somewhere else and see an example of it.
But I'll say, as we were looking at, even this is a new building I'm thinking of that we're working on, and getting to the energy code compliance would basically require triple glazing. And when you say that, then the engineers, freak out because that's a lot more load. It's super heavy. So I think anything that's going to be out there to make it lighter is probably going to be successful. Because just you can't. There's only so much you can do with
It's
two
interesting,
shades.
Ellie. Do you think that's a little overblown, that people get freaked out or taken aback by triple glazing?
When you start getting into triple glazing and sound control, and it's not just the weight, it's the cost of the triple glazing too. Now, bird friendly glass, maybe one light of laminated, you handle that glass multiple times, it's going to be scratched. So you're going to have a high reject rate, especially with coatings, because the triple glazing is generally having at least two coatings on it, right? So there's a lot of handling of that glass. Man, the chances of scratching it are tremendous. Now you have it on a structurally glazed curtain wall that's got to be reglazed from the outside. These are all things that people with experience who've gone through it start bringing it up in the meetings. And even if it's not the weight, it's the chances of that happening that start to really become a problem.
Funny you mentioned that. It's one thing showing a nice looking marketing brochure and getting something specified, but when the when the facade superintendent is in the bid review, or the guy who's done it before starts, well, wait a minute, we're going to have to handle that on a man lift, or we're going to have to do this, and all of a sudden
Yeah.
practicality comes into place and we start actually thinking about feasibility.
Yeah, and I'm talking about handling during production of the glass. Anything that's got three lights of glass is usually handled 1/3 more just for that. But now you're handling it even more because a lot of these coatings have to be applied after the glass is tempered. So it just becomes a real potentially a bad problem with rejected glass, and that impacts schedules, impacts, sign offs, the whole 9 yards. I'm not anti triple glazed. I'm not. I probably sound like I am right now, but I think that that's another one of these stopgap measures that will get passed quickly if vacuum glass can prove its longevity. I mean, that you brought that up. That's the thing right now. They have to do the IGMA testing and make sure that they show that it's going to survive 30 years.
Yep. Did we lose Kate?
Yeah, I think she's frozen. Okay, we could banter till she gets back.
Yeah.
So one of the things that Kate and I found out on our last project that we were working on, we worked with Turner, and our project team member from Turner was mentioning that a big part of what the requirements are coming out with now is reglazability of a new facade. If you're recladding a building, they want that cladding system to survive more than 20 years. They want it to be upgradable, and that's a big deal now. And that's something that I think we'll start hearing a lot more about.
Yeah, I think I've kind of lived in the interior glazed, replaced glass from the inside world, and sometimes we look at a curtain wall job. I had a big one we looked at recently at one of the big hospitals, and they were replacing punched window units with curtain wall, and it was an exterior glazed unit. And right away, just thinking they only wanted union labor and the cost associated, forget 10 years down the line, 20, even during construction, to get out there and replace a piece of glass. You can only imagine. The other thing is just having to completely rip out or rip open walls, or the damage associated with replacing that piece of glass. I had this conversation recently too, like the maintainability of punch windows versus window wall and curtain wall. I mean, once your receptors are buried, it's hard to get access to them, as opposed to, if you have a barrier system or something else with a punched window, being able to easily replace that unit if your opaque wall is going to stay in place probably longer than the life cycle of the glazing.
Yeah, this is all going to start coming into play as we start talking about, people have been talking to me ad nauseum about embodied carbon. The best way to not use up what carbon we have is to reuse the buildings we have and reuse as much of the building as we can. And that's where I think that having an upgradable curtain wall, and Kate, I was just talking about what one of the things that Charlie Whitney brought up when working on that last project, and we presented in Switzerland, about upgradability in these new facade systems, that they don't want the main system to just last 20 years. They're okay with changing glazing after 30 years because probably in 30 years we'll have some other tech that's really worthwhile, but they don't want to have to reclad the whole building in 20, 30 years. They want it to be able to be an upgradable system. We didn't really think about that 15 years ago and 10 years ago. It's newer.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a lot of research now about how you deconstruct something, right? Which is a really
Right.
interesting way of thinking about it. And in terms of, what we've been talking about primarily is operational carbon. But certainly when you look at carbon footprint from a life cycle perspective, that's really important. So
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's where the real discussion about embodied carbon should be, is what's the service life of whatever we're choosing to put in that building.
Yeah, the existing buildings is one avenue or discussion point, but every new build, how are we talking about even how we're going to be able to convert it to some other type of space, whether it be hotel or housing or office or mixed use or whatever it might be.
Yeah, floor plates, floor heights. As an architect, I think this is Kate's specialty more than mine, but designing for that potential that the use of the building will change, it's got to be extremely challenging, right?
yeah, and I think, one thing is not really facade related, but lease spans are a huge thing because a lot of the conversions that are being looked at, they're like, what can we do with this interior space? Because everyone was so psyched that the office lease span was so big, and now it's actually not helping you at all when you try to turn it into a residential, just because of your light and air requirements. So
Yeah, you have this huge trading floor, and all of a sudden now, what do you need? Don't you need a certain proximity from the livable space to fresh air or to the window? There's a certain dimension that's
right.
required per code.
There is,
Um,
and some people are getting around it by calling it a home office, which doesn't have any windows.
Well, I like this
Um,
concept of a light well, basically cutting a core in the middle of the
sure,
building, and all
we
of a
love
sudden
that
opening it
too.
all up.
Talk about the budget though. I mean, that is the coolest thing about this kind of work is like my partner calls it the nip and tuck, but when you think about the overall FAR footprint of the building and how you might use that area more efficiently, it's super tempting to cut a hole somewhere and then put it back on top, right? That's
Well, this was fun. Thank you both for hopping on.
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Until next time.
Okay, bye.